Welcome to a bonus series on the Life Giver podcast. Made possible by the USO, these bonus episodes are from a monthly series called You're Leaving Again, where the USO is following Matt and I during our deployment, and we are sharing our authentic story with you. Whether you're going through your own deployment, are geo-baching, on an unaccompanied tour, or maybe getting ready to, this series aims to be the first of its kind. Real life, gritty, but resourceful content aimed to help you keep your marriage and family strong while you're apart. So whether you're a military spouse or a service member, this series is for you. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, or head outside for a walk and listen in as Matt and I share what we are learning apart with you. So excited to spend some time with all of you guys. My name is Corie. I don't know where he is on your screen, but he's on mine. There's Matt, and we are currently going through our own deployment right now. So he's currently deployed, and I'm back at home with the kids, and we're just honored to partner with the USO and share a little bit of our story as it progresses month to month, and also do these webinars in a way that are topical, hopefully topics that will really resonate with you and hopefully encourage you. And so this month we wanted to do the topic on communication. Matt, you've been gone for, are we on month 4, 5? 4, I think so. And so I think that that's like a perfect time for us to start talking about communication, right? Because I think, if you go back and listen to the other parts of this series, you're going to see that we've kind of walked through like what it's like before you go, and then ripping the Band-Aid. And then over the holidays, we talked about like, how do you build your relationship through the holidays, any kind of holiday, really. We touched on parenting. Last month, we touched on intimacy, which is a big factor when couples are apart. And so communication, especially by month 5, no matter what you kind of set out as far as your intentions of staying connected and trying to communicate well, by month 4 or 5, communication and trying to figure out how to do that well definitely is a real topic. And so we're going to share a little bit about what our experience has been like trying to communicate. If you've been following us this whole time, we kind of set out with some goals. We've been using a tool along the way to kind of communicate. We're going to share a little bit about that. But then we're also going to address the actual topic of healthy communication. And so as a counselor that works with military and first responder couples, and Matt as a chaplain, which I'll let you do your disclosure here in just a minute, so we don't forget to do that. Communication is like one of the biggest topics. When I ask couples, what's bringing you in for counseling, or what do you want to work on? Communication is usually like the top answer, but I don't know if people or couples often know, like, what is it about the communication that we need to adjust? I think most often we're talking about connection and how do we connect better. And that's definitely true in a separation, what we call a military initiated separation. So even if you are not separated from your spouse right now, this is going to totally apply to you, because communication in general and doing that in a healthy way is so important. But especially when you're apart, it's really hard. So Matt, I'll let you introduce yourself. And I know you do like a little disclosure thing, so I'll let you do that.
I've got it written out. So hi, my name's Chaplain Matthew Weathers. The views expressed are those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Department of the Army, Department of Defense, or the United States government.
There you go. Like, you get more formal with each webinar.
Well, actually, I have to give a shout out to the friend. You sent me the opinion piece from a friend of ours, and he included it at the bottom. And I was like, I'm going to read that tonight. That's going to be good.
It's a good way to cover things.
I try and just do this massive covering of all of it. I figured I could actually use the actual lingo.
Always smart to fall within regulations where you can. Well, we are just welcoming all of you. Please use the chat. We are going to take your questions and also address some of the questions that you turned in at registration. They're great questions. We'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. So I think, Matt, what we should do to start off today is, we've been trying to be really authentic in our story. There's not a whole lot of content out there for couples going through deployment on like, what is it really like to go through deployment? And the whole purpose of this is to validate other couples that go through what is probably normal in a deployment, including struggling to communicate. And so I can definitely provide an update, but I thought maybe to start off with, what have you learned in the last month? What have you kind of been going through since the last time we did the last webinar? What would be your update?
One thing that came to mind before I actually do the update is just in case nobody has ever most people haven't sat through one of our, got to put my fidget spinner down. I got to put that down. So nobody hasn't gone through a marriage retreat with us. So to introduce Corie and I as communicators, I am a deep-seated extrovert and my wife is an introvert. I have to talk out a lot of things and she does a lot of stuff inside of her head. And then sometimes forgets that she does it so intensely that she forgets she hasn't actually said that to people. And so just want to let you know if there's, I think in most married couples, you have one person or the other that tends to be more extroverted or introverted. And so that does shape how we communicate, how we approach communication, and our theories on it, and the different ways that we struggle in our communication. So the update since the last time, since February, my gosh, Groundhog Day happens and you're like, what month is it? It's like the Gandalf, Lord of the Rings. I have no memory of this place. So what's been updated? Well, honestly, if we're going to be vulnerable and honest. So I've been over here watching my wife go through a central Texas storm that was devastating to a lot of people and luckily not to my family, but also watching both of our boys, our 14 and 17-year-old, or 13 and 17, 13 and 16.
They're still 13 and 16. You haven't been gone that long.
14 and, so 13 and 16 get COVID. And which was devastating for us because our son has asthma. Luckily, they're on the other side of it. It just came across as bad colds, but it was hard for us because we've kept him in virtual school up until one of them started to fail a class and the other one started to fail at life and relationships in general. And so we both made the decision right after Christmas, hey, send the boys back. And then since last time, both of them got COVID within 2 weeks of getting back to school. And we made it through it. But I've been over here powerless, watching her struggle with things at home, which, as a service member, you beat yourself up over kind of what the job takes you away and what it takes from you. And then the tax and the toll that your family has to pay on the other end. So that's really kind of what we've been going through, what I've been struggling with. Luckily, things have kind of evened out now. It's been a month of feeling very powerless in this place, but we have made it through. And I'm incredibly proud of how you did that.
It wasn't smooth. And can I just be authentic with that? It wasn't exactly smooth. And he's being very generous. Before the ice storm of Texas, if you guys saw on the news, we had I know it sounds crazy for Texas to just get snow and for it to be devastating, but it really genuinely, we've lived in Colorado and it was, you could go ice skating outside our backyard. And so it was pretty significant. And I feel so grateful coming out of that we did not lose power and water. There was a lot of people that really were burning furniture to stay warm. And you can't leave your house to go anywhere else. You're just kind of stuck in your home. But he's being generous. The week before all of that, somewhere in there, I also had a breast cancer scare that I'm going to share only because we're talking about communication. And I think we kind of hit what a lot of couples probably go through when there's even something like that happens. And how that impacts your communication, because it was a really interesting thing to go through in that, I'm not saying this was the right thing to do. And I can say that I learned something about communication from this process. But at the time, I was really, I'm introverted. And so I was thinking that applies to what we're talking about today as far as how you process information impacts how you communicate information. And so for me, I didn't want him to feel powerless. I didn't want him to be more scared than we needed to be. And I thought we needed more information. And once I have information that was worth sharing, then I would share that with him. And so I kept that information. And I'll be honest, I actually kept that initial mammogram kind of diagnosis, whatever, to myself, because I had the example of other military spouses who had been through it before, who had also made the choice to hold off and not share it with their spouse until they had more information. And so I thought, you know what, that feels okay. It doesn't feel right, but it feels okay until I had more information. And I didn't want him to feel that powerless. And so I kind of kept that from him, and honestly kept it from a lot of people. And I should not have. I learned that lesson in all this, that I should not have. And I eventually, I remember I had a biopsy scheduled, and I remember I had this thought one morning that I was like, you know what, all he needs to do is check my calendar and he'll see that I have a biopsy scheduled, and then we'll have a conversation. And in that moment, if I was actually in my heart trying to hide something from him, I think that I would have taken that off right then. There was a part of me that really wanted him to know. And you can honestly unpack that on so many levels on what that means for couples. But I'm sharing this with you because it's an interesting dynamic that we have as spouses back at home, where you try your best to be very protective of how you communicate and how much you communicate, and either we kind of lean towards one area where we overshare, which I definitely do. In fact, I think we've figured out every Saturday I just dump everything in his lap, and then I'm usually in tears by then, and then he's like, "Hope you feel better." That's not a great approach either. Or we hold back too much. And that was a good example of that as well. And so I had this breast cancer scare. Everything turned out fine. But then right on the end of that, coming out of exhaustion with that's when we had the ice storm, and then the boys having COVID in the middle of that. And it was a very intense month, and a lot of communication and trying to figure out how to navigate through this. And Matt, I'll let you respond to this, but I mean, there was part of me that throughout this last month, I really didn't feel like I was necessarily falling apart, although I'm sure it looked like it at times, but I didn't feel like I was falling apart. But it definitely was at a limit of whether or not I can do much more or handle much more stress than I was already handling. And so there was a part of me that was like, I don't want him to feel like I can't do this or that I'm falling apart here. But I also need to share with him, this is really hard. And I want to communicate, this is really stressful. And I want him to be present with me in that. But it was really hard for me. I'm seeing a lot of other people going, yes, I've been there. And so I'm wondering, for some of you that are listening, especially if you're a spouse, because I think Matt can share from the serving spouse perspective, that there's a part of you that's like, I want to share, but I'm either I'm going from one spectrum of extreme of oversharing to not sharing at all. And how do I land in the middle and be authentic without looking like I'm completely falling apart, when I feel like I kind of just need to let it out and then I'm good again. So wondering if everybody else is kind of feeling the same. So Matt, I mean, I know you were not happy with me for good reason for not sharing that with you. And I would love for you to share with everybody what you told me when we had that first phone call about how that impacted you for me to not share that with you. And also, what do you remember what you said to me about who we are? You're giving me big eyes. He's like, I don't remember. Speaking of communication. Well, I'll tell you what he said. First of all,
I'm a futurist. Remember, I'm forward thinking. All right.
Well, but this was really important to me, and that's why I remember it more than you saying it. But the first thing you said to me was, of course, I'm glad that you're okay. But number two is we don't do this. We don't do this alone. We don't do this life alone. And so whatever you're going through, I need to know what you're going through, because you don't get to go through things like that by yourself. And I loved that. I needed it. It was hard to hear because I knew that I didn't do the right thing. If I could go back and go again, or if I could talk to my friends, I mean, I definitely talked to a few of them afterwards and said, and they understood, just like you guys are saying, yeah, I get it. They understood. But as soon as he said that, you don't get to keep those things from me. Secrets are not good. And I agreed with that completely. But you, more than that, you're not supposed to go through that kind of level of stress or frustration or fear by yourself. And if I could go back, it's definitely not something that I would want to do alone again.
Yeah. So, I mean, part of it, there were a couple things. Number one was the ability to encourage you through it. Now, I know that, the different things that we've had that have happened during deployment, totaling the car, things breaking down, things falling apart, health scares, kids being unruly. I know that 110%, you're having to face that and usually face that alone, whether it's just a time zone difference or an inability for me to be able to weigh in or assist with a decision. And so sometimes I just want to, not sometimes, all the time, I want to be able to come alongside you and just really cheer you on, because I actually want to see, I love watching you grow as a human. I love watching you become more decisive. As service members, we get, I'll speak for a lot of them, especially leaders, we get decision fatigue. We are hit with so much information that we have to make a decision about. So really there's the preface of it and this applies deployment and when we're both in the same physical location of prefacing something with, I don't need you to make a decision about it. I don't need you to weigh it, maybe talk it through with me. But I know I've got to own this and I'm going to own this. Or, just listen. I just want you to hear how I had to process it. I want you to hear what it meant to me and how it felt. So when you have that little tagline, just as much as I have a tagline of whenever I do one of these events, that these are all my own views, if you have a little tagline that leads with, okay, so everything's good. I don't need you to make a decision on this. I already have a way ahead, or I just want you to hear me out. I know it may be tough to hear how I'm processing this, but I don't blame you. I'm not shaming you. I'm not resentful. This is just where I'm at. This is what I'm dealing with life. If you give that little disclosure, that little disclaimer at the beginning, and then you begin to go into what you're unpacking, it allows me to not feel like I have to make a decision. And because of our faith standpoint, it allows me to pray for you. It allows me to encourage you and come alongside you. It allows me to be even more thoughtful in the way that I relate to you. Because if I don't know what's going on with you, chances are more than likely I'm going to be kind of obtuse or unfeeling, or I could come across as very uncaring. And so if you don't share information with me and then you get resentful because I'm not being caring, is it my fault?
Right. It's a great point. And I'm going to respond to what Nicole said here in just a minute. It's so true. And here's what's interesting is that, sometimes we don't say anything and we're kind of overly protecting our spouse that does not need protection. Now, I will say, I've talked with Matt and I've talked with other service members, and they've said, like, if you are struggling and you're not, I call it building a house there, like building a house in your suffering, building a house and living in that place of unhealthy coping, then that is going to make your service member feel completely powerless and completely like, I don't know how to help you if you can't use the resources around you to help yourself. Right. Mm-hmm. So there is an element of them feeling powerless. But aside from that, I just want to say I think it's really ironic that sometimes we don't share information because we make an assumption of how they're going to respond to that information. And so in this case, I made the assumption that between the two of us, you would spiral into fear more than me. And so I made that assumption to protect you from, like, I guess, yourself. And what's amazing, all of you guys, is that he actually did not respond that way at all. In fact, his response was actually caring and calculated in the best way and vision casting and there for me. And I would have missed out on that if I just made the assumption that he was going to, respond in a certain way. So I think part of the message today in healthy communication is, number one, owning your own communication, number one. Mm-hmm. And number two, this is so hard to do. Even after 22 years of marriage, we can say, number two is trying not to manage the other person's communication for them or manage their feelings, and me protecting him from himself was honestly me managing him, and he didn't need me to manage him. He gets to manage himself. Right. And if he were to come back in a way that was maybe unhealthy, then that's my role in this relationship and as his friend, and this is vice versa, for me to then bring that to him and say, okay, what I really need from you right now is such and such, right? I have to then own my own communication back. So I do want to respond to what Nicole said, because I think it's a really important, great point. We actually went through our first deployment with Nicole. And so I'm trying to pull up your comment here, Nicole. She said, my scare was during a combat deployment. It's definitely different than his last Korea deployment. And it's hard to distinguish after being through a combat deployment, in my opinion. And so, Nicole, I'm going to try to speak for you, because we were there. I was there with you as a spouse through that combat deployment. Matt was with your husband during that combat deployment, or at least one of them, the one that stands out to us. And so,
no, let me make a note. The way you said that, it makes it sound like at least one of her husbands. She's only having had one husband.
No, so. Yeah, thank you. No, I didn't mean that. No, but it was a significant deployment with a lot of scary situations. We lost a lot of really amazing soldiers. And so I think, Nicole, what you're saying, which I think is really important, is that sometimes when you've been through a deployment that is intense, that is extreme, where there really is a lot of dangerous things happening, when you really do need your service member to have their mind on the mission and not on the things that are happening at home. And so you really do, in those kind of situations, be really protective of what you're sharing. And so I can imagine that after and can I say, Nicole, that your husband was shot in the knee, I believe, during that deployment. And so he did come home injured, right? That's significant. That's a big deal. And so after going through something like that, I would bet that it kind of confuses your, how do I share? When do I share? And some things that don't feel like a big deal because you've been through something that's a very big deal, right? So these other things may not feel like it's a huge deal. So maybe it's not worthy of sharing, or maybe this is not, just doesn't compare to that experience that you had. And that can complicate communication too. And so that's what I'm reading. Please comment if you're hearing something different or wanted to say something different. Go ahead, Matt.
So one thing I also wanted to say for service members, especially during that time, and those deployments are still happening and going on, that service members also, and you definitely hit the nail on the head in your book, is that we each have those sacred spaces of those places where you're like, what do I share and when do I share and how do I share it? It happens on both sides of the ponds of, what information and when. Probably one of my biggest regrets is not taking more time during those first few deployments to actually document what I was experiencing, what I was thinking, and what I was feeling. We kept a really good email track back and forth, and called as much as possible to be able to process that, and that helped light years towards our reintegration, which was still very rocky. Mm-hmm. So what I would tell people right now is, like, do not wait. If you're not processing or communicating over phone, over video, over email, over chat, and you're not sending that information real time, and you don't feel like you can, document that information so that when your significant other comes home, then you can be able to go, okay, now you're home, now we're safe, now we're good. Here's my journey. Like, here's the log of what I've just gone through. Like, if you want the code for who I am right now, how I've changed over the past few months, this is it. This is what I was thinking and what I was feeling. And so if you're not keeping them up to date real time, then when you get into reintegration, it's going to be almost impossible to try and figure out who the new person standing in front of me actually is. And so for communication, it's not just simply about, like, how do we avoid arguments? It's literally about, like, lean in, like, how do I be more intentional so that you can understand my internal world, so that when you encounter me next, then you know. Yeah.
It's Steve.
Yeah. All right. Oh. Yeah. Yeah. No, he did. Good. So I'm not. Okay. I'm not gonna cry. I'm not gonna cry. So I'll call him later. Anyhow, that's good. I mean, keeping that journal in a rack, keeping those times because then you can lean back on it. And then I know that all of us, that have young kids, at some point in time, you want to be able to explain who you are and how you changed. And this is who I was before, and this is what made me different. And to give them that context, it's crucial, not just for leaving a legacy, but for helping them understand your heart and your mind. So I think the intentionality in communication is key.
So I think that's so important, and I'm so glad we're talking about this today, because communication can be just so impacted when you guys are spending time apart. And if you're making those conscious choices to communicate or not communicate, I think the question always needs to be, how do I communicate and communicate this well? Couple of things before I get, because we're not going to have a ton of time to go through some very important material that I think will be really helpful to you. A couple of the other things that have stood out to us over the last month: time zones have definitely played a part in interrupting our communication, or what our normal communication would be. I know that sounds obvious, but it's been a real struggle for me on my side. We've been sharing this amazing journal. We've shared at each webinar where we're using the Day One journal app, where we just log into the same account. And, while I'm sleeping, he is journaling what's going on in his day, what's going on in his mind. And then the next day, usually while he's asleep, I'm kind of journaling something. And so each day we kind of wake up to the other person's journal prompt. And that's been really wonderful. And I'll be honest, it was a little hard for me at first to do it every single day. There was times I was like, what are we going to talk about? But I will also say, I'm so glad I pushed through on the other side of that. And I know Matt has shared on here and with me several times as an extrovert how valuable doing journaling has been for him. There were times that I kind of beat myself up, because with all of that I was going through, my journal entries were just subpar compared to his. His were so thoughtful, and his were so concentrated, and mine, I felt like I was sometimes, honestly, I was passing out asleep as I'm writing, and so it was really a struggle for me. And I really accidentally locked myself in unnecessarily to that time zone issue, because I felt like if I wrote in the morning, well, he's up during the day, I should just call him and have the conversation instead of writing. And so I would hold off writing until the evening when I was too tired to write. And he even shared with me, you shared with me yesterday, Matt, I would much rather you write when you feel like you are fresh and able to use your mind to think clearly, and then repeat that information in a phone call, than get locked into how the time zone makes a difference. But I just felt like I was going to repeat information. And so what's the point? And so I'm really trying to work my way out of that and try to have a little bit more intentionality of when I write, that it doesn't matter what time of day and whether or not he gets it early or whatever, that it's more, because this is something that, oh man, it's downstairs to show you the book that you ordered. That of the day we actually ordered, Matt shared in a previous webinar that he compiled all of our previous emails into this journal app, and that you can print off a book version at the end. And so he actually, for Valentine's Day, printed off. And so I have a book downstairs of all of our emails from that first deployment. So it was a really, really cool. And I wanted to show it to you this time, so I won't be able to show it to you this time, but it's really worth it. So that's been good.
If I start talking, you can run downstairs.
I can. How about you do that really quick? Go.
Well, okay. So couple things on the communication. The content. Okay. So when we were talking about journaling and we're talking about talking on the video, it's always key to understand what's the best mode of communication for the content of communication that you're trying to put out there. So for instance, I know that if there's more difficult topics for Corie and I to discuss, and that as an introvert, she needs a little bit more time to be able to process it, rather than to be able to not confront, but rather to be able to talk about it with her on video chat or on the phone. It's easier if I give her that information ahead of time and allow her to process it and think it through. And then when she's processing it and thinking it through, then I know that I'll receive a more thoughtful response. Versus if we're just sitting here bantering back and forth, talking about the boys, talking about what's going on in her life, that's very low threat. It's very low key. And the other part of it is taking time to thoughtfully journal or thoughtfully email in your communication allows you to be able to process it out loud, read it back before your significant other reads it, and then decide, okay, well, maybe I actually just worked that issue out just by kind of blurting that out on the page, and actually don't need to send it. It's kind of like those mad emails that you end up never sending. You're just able to process it out, and then you go, okay, was that going to bring me closer to my significant other, or was it going to take me away? And if it's going to take me away from that, I really need to decide, is this something that I need to talk about? Number one, at all. And number two, is it something to talk about like right now? So
here's quickly what the book looks like. So he was able to choose the cover. Obviously, this was a deployment to Afghanistan. It's a great hardcover book. It's really awesome, guys. But like you can see, like these are some of our emails. He was able to put in like photos. This is like our welcome home at the end of the book. And so he actually put in the photos that go with that time of that deployment. But it really is an amazing, and we're not making any money off this day one app. This is just a tool that we're using. And so we wanted to test like what if we're going to talk about using it. But it's really beautiful. And I think since it's hardcover, we'll be able to do that for this deployment too, which is super fun.
Yeah.
Okay. So a couple of things I see people saying, somebody else mentioned they have a 13-hour time difference. It really does impact. And I think we need to be okay and be honest about that sometimes and share with each other how that impacts your communication is super helpful. So, okay, here's if you're okay with it, Matt, I think we can get into a little bit of what does healthy communication look like? Because again, I know we get this topic all the time, which is healthy communication. And I think in order for us to talk about what healthy communication is, we have to talk about what does unhealthy communication look like, so that we can recognize when we need to make the switch, right? So you have you should have gotten a PDF, like a listening guide that came with your registration. If you want to pull that up afterwards, you can. I am going to screen share just one page of it here in just a minute, so you have a visual. But I'm not going to read through all of it, but there's a couple things that I want to point out that I think is really important as far as some myths about communication that a lot of people believe in marriage. And so just really quick, a couple of the myths to think about is that a healthy marriage with good communication does not mean that they're conflict free. Okay. Friction is actually what makes a car go. The tires having friction with the pavement moves you forward, right? So conflict isn't necessarily bad, but if it's unhealthy communication and conflict, that is where it can become destructive. But if you have healthy communication in that conflict, it's actually a powerful tool that leads to growth, that leads to forgiveness, that leads to empathy and understanding and awareness of what's going on in both worlds and how to bring that together. It's very, very important. And conflict is going to happen, especially in our military couple world, when we are living literally two totally different lives. And I had a session this morning where we were talking about even when you're at home, you're still having two very different experiences of the military. Unless you're a dual service couple, you're really having two totally different perspectives of the military and how the military feels to you, right? And so anytime you're communicating that, it's going to be ripe for miscommunication. Another couple of things, not every healthy marriage that you see out there that has great communication started off that way. Okay. I would say most couples, including us, we're still growing. We're still trying to figure it out, but we share openly that the first few years of our marriage were very, very difficult. And we really struggled in those first beginning years, a lot because of expectations, a lot because we had poor communication. But it's really about how do you continue to grow and get better over time? And what are you learning? I love the fact that, Steve and Nicole were talking about how they use marriage books. We recommend all the time finding a book or a tool that you can do together, whether it's a journal, whether it's reading a book together, so that you have that conversation and have something to talk about. Will always get you growing. Did you want to say something?
So an encouragement. Yeah. Just if you've never been able to we've never been able to kind of be vulnerable and honest with you, like the way we are at kind of our marriage retreats. Growing up what do you think? 3, 4, it's about 5 years. You would say 5 years, first 5 years of our marriage were incredibly difficult. So you say 5, I say 4, but 5, we'll say on 5. And a lot of that was just because we didn't know how to figure out marriage, didn't know what to do. And so in encouragement, just take a minute. The thing that changed our marriage dynamic, and Corie, this goes back to you talking about wanting to manage me and to manage my emotions and my feelings. And you finally just said, you know what, you're going to have to own that. And I can't own that for you. And I can't make those changes internally. that I wish you would make. And so you took ownership of yourself in terms of keeping your side of the street clean and taking care of yourself. And that changes the dynamic. I mean, it's just like any system. Once you changed, I was given really only 3 options within the system. And that was to change with you. That was to work really hard to make you change back, or that was to leave. And for you and I, leaving was never an option. And I began to see that you actually seemed happier that you had made changes, and I kind of like, that was enticing to see somebody that had more joy and more peace in their life. And that's what pulled me towards wanting to make those changes. And then once I got started making the changes, I started sprinting through the changes because I was like, wow, this feels really good. It's like eating healthy. This feels really good. I think I'm going to keep doing this. And then you had to start running faster, metaphorically, to be able to catch up too. And so it's not simply about directing energy towards the other person to try and enforce them to change. Direct the energy and really focus on yourself, about being your best self and managing yourself, and it will change the dynamic. So that's really what the turning point was for us, as far as being able to figure out our communication, understanding that you're an introvert and I'm an extrovert, and the way that I need to be able to process information for me to tell you, and this goes into the communication thing, for me to tell you, hey, the first thing out of my mouth isn't the most true thing, but it's the start that I'm going to have to start making to get on the journey to find out like exactly how I feel about this, or what I'm actually thinking about. That's the way that an extrovert works. So if I don't get all those minutes that I need to kind of verbally, express everything before I'm like, this is how I feel, this is what I think. It's not what I said initially. It's what it is now. Now this is how I think. Once I get to there, then I'm like, oh, but I also have to realize and be protective over what I say, because I don't want to do damage along the way on that journey. So that I, at the end of that journey, feel like, wow, I was able to express all this stuff. I feel great. Only to have you be sitting there going, yeah, but can we deal with the third sentence? Because the third sentence sounded like crap.
Right, exactly. Okay, so there's a couple of things that you said I want to respond to. Number one, he talked about the importance of boundaries, and we won't be able to go into this very deep today, but boundaries in marriage are crucial. A lot of times we think that, we're supposed to share all things, and we are, like, we live under a house together, but that doesn't mean there's no boundaries within the house, right? And so having healthy boundaries between what do I own versus, what's my responsibility versus what's his responsibility, and being able to communicate those boundaries in a kind way. We're going to give you some tools on how to do that. But boundaries need to be in your relationship. It's how we communicate them. And what I find for couples is that yes, I mean, it's kind of difficult for couples to realize that boundaries need to be there. But what's even harder for couples is drawing the line. But I will tell you what's even harder for couples, where they really get stuck, is the disappointment if your spouse doesn't respect those boundaries, and now you have to kind of have some level of consequences, or at least express your feelings and your thoughts about the fact that they didn't honor those boundaries. And how do I communicate and enforce that boundary line? That is where couples really struggle, because in our minds, we just can't comprehend why somebody that we love so much wouldn't honor and respect boundaries. And so that's where people really get stuck. So boundaries is super important. He also mentioned how we kind of got to that point where I kind of set some boundaries with him, and really it was just out of a place of, I don't know what else to do other than just take care of my own mental health, and then you get to decide whether or not you take care of yours. And I will either continue to grow and you won't, or we're going to grow together. But that's the only thing I knew how to do at the time. And so by me kind of moving forward like this, then nobody likes to be left behind in marriage. Like, we all want to grow together. And so what that does is it encouraged him to grow alongside and kind of catch up with me. But then what happened is he kind of started to outgrow me, and that makes me feel insecure. And he also held me accountable on some things that I needed to change. And suddenly I was faced with the same situation of, I either need to grow and respect what he's asking me to change, that is a healthy request, or he's going to outgrow me, right? And so there is this dynamic in marriage that we kind of sometimes grow like this. Sometimes we grow together by reading a book together, using a tool together, and we're learning the the same things at the same time. But there's often times where we're kind of like going through life ebbing and flowing this way, and that can be healthy too. So, you also mentioned something, Matt, about we've mentioned several times about introverts versus extroverts. Again, we could do a whole webinar on just that. But he was describing what that's like for the extrovert and needing to be able to process that out loud all the way through. And that first draft that comes out is usually where the introvert gets stuck, because we usually keep all of that information in our head. And then when we finally figure out what we want to say, then we say it. So it's really confusing to us when the extrovert starts off and says something that's so jumbled and maybe it feels destructive or it was something hard to hear, but that was just their first draft. They're trying to get their way to their final draft, but we get stuck as introverts on that first initial draft and we stop listening, right? So that's by the time they get to their final draft, they're like, this is what I really mean. This is what I'm trying to say. By the time they get there, we're like, I haven't heard anything that you said because I'm so hurt by the first draft that you said, right? So again, this is why we started journaling, because we found journaling helps both introverts and extroverts find their words at the same time.
You know, for an extrovert, that's why journaling is really important, simply because you can process it without doing the damage. The other part about the boundaries that's so key is that, being able to communicate what those boundaries are, not just throwing the boundary up and then the other person trying to guess what they are, but to be able to say, hey, this is where I'm at. This is who I am now. The decisions that I'm making for myself. And to be able to own that and just say, I'm making it for myself. I'm making it for my own sanity, for my own well-being. And owning that is helpful.
Okay. So unhealthy communication, you probably have heard of these before, but we're going to actually get to here in a second what is assertive communication. But very few people actually talk about and teach assertive communication. We just kind of maybe passively learn this unhealthy form of communication. And then we go into marriage doing the best that we can. But assertive is where we want to go. But first, let's talk about the other three. And I think we can do this quickly because a lot of you have heard of this before. But you have on this spectrum passive, passive-aggressive, and aggressive communication. And all three of those are unhealthy versions of communication. So passive, Matt, I'll let you kind of come in on passive-aggressive and aggressive, and I'll cover passive. That's not for a specific reason. Just
you're stupid like your father.
That's from Dane Cook. If you've not heard Vicious Circle, a lot of bad words in it. Listen to the clean TV version. Okay. Passive is really when you have thoughts, feelings, opinions that you want to share, but you're afraid to share them and you just don't. And so maybe you're apologetic, overly apologetic. You keep them inside, you repress them inside, and then you probably walk around your home wondering why nobody understands you, because to you might be communicating them, or you're waiting for someone else to ask you what you feel before you feel that, or before you communicate them. And so, it may be because you've come from a background or you're currently in a relationship where you don't feel like you have the space or the right to share it. Maybe you've been run over a lot in communication, and so you just kind of hold it to yourself. But again, if we're going to talk about taking responsibility for your own personal communication, if you lean towards passivity, it's really about deciding this is not healthy for me. I've got to learn how to communicate openly what I'm feeling and take ownership of that. Now, I'm going to just throw this out here. This would be a very interesting conversation for you to circle up some military couples and have a conversation about this. But one of the things I'm seeing within the spouse culture, just let me talk about the spouse culture, is that over time, as we have to constantly adapt and move and relocate, and the military kind of tells us what we're going to do and where we're going to go, over time, I've found that spouses habitually start leaning towards passivity. And even if you kind of came in as an assertive, maybe even as an aggressive kind of personality, that after a while, you kind of get to a place where you're so used to not being able to feel like you have a voice or a choice, you just stop sharing it. And unfortunately, the spouse community kind of does this. We kind of can become aggressive to each other. And so a spouse, can say, maybe a more senior spouse they don't mean to, but when we start saying things like pull up your big girl panties and get over it, like that phrase, that's an aggressive phrase of, whatever you're feeling, stuff it inside, don't share it and drive on, right? That's an aggressive form of kind of stepping on someone else's rights to have and express their feelings and thoughts, and telling them to keep it inside. And then I'll share a little bit about passive aggressive, and then Matt, you can go from there. Passive aggressive is kind of you still hold it inside, but externally in your behavior, you're doing things that are hinting that you have feelings, hinting that there's something under the surface, all the while hoping that the other person is going to notice it and ask. So maybe you're stomping around the house, you're slamming doors, you're, shrugging, you're just not really communicating, all with the hope that your spouse is going to go, oh my gosh, like, are you okay? Is something wrong? And then as soon as they ask, then you unload, right? When really owning your feelings and being able to express it, that we can do that without making them guess.
Next time on the Life Giver podcast.
Assertiveness is like not being passive anymore. And we're actually going to say the thing that is like, it's the elephant in the room. It's the thing that's between you and your spouse. It's the thing that's keeping you distant. So we've got to have the courage to say these things out loud. It's just how we do it.
Thank you for listening to the Life Giver podcast. If you're enjoying these episodes, please share the podcast with other service couples that may benefit from the show. If you'd like more information about me or Life Giver, head on over to CorieWeathers.com or life-giver.org.